Buenas tardes, gracias. Me encanta estar aquí. He venido varias veces a escuchar, a invitar a gente a hacer performances. Nada más, por quien no sabe, aquí es una instalación de bocinas en multicanal, entonces supongo que no estamos en estéreo hoy, pero agradezco FICUNAM por la invitación. Arranco yo en español, luego ya, I'm just doing this in English, in Spanish first. A mí me invitaron, Max me invitó pensando que yo era muy amigo de Luke y para nada, no soy muy amigo de Luke, pero sigo su trabajo hace mucho tiempo, sobre todo en festivales en Escocia que siempre han mezclado bien el moving image, como que trabaja en 16, lo que podemos llamar cine expandido ahora, y sonido. Entonces, yo tenía un festival en Londres y aprendí mucho de esos festivales y sobre todo el trabajo de Luke, así que me sentí muy honrado de sentarme a su lado. Y por otro lado, la instalación que está ahorita en la sala, que obviamente les invitamos a ver, es como una muy buena impronta de su versatilidad en el trabajo que hace Luke, porque multidisciplinario seguramente es, y a veces es muy fácil decir eso, pero trabaja con una curiosidad de un detalle hacia sus personajes, el audio, el sonido, la instalación, que creo que justamente la pieza que nos contará será también una buena parte. Entonces, a partir de ahora pasamos en inglés y es una cosa bastante relajada. Vamos a aprender más sobre su trabajo y luego FICUNAM nos tendrá que decir cuándo tiene su programación de umbral. So it's tomorrow, so like tomorrow afternoon, 4:30, there's four shorts. So entonces van a haber 2 proyecciones en FICUNAM de su trabajo. Y también eres jurado de la competencia de umbral, que es la parte más de cine experimental de del festival. So we were wondering how we would like to kind of a kickstart. So I think there's going to be a bit of a work around your aesthetic and your thoughts behind your filmmaking. I know we could stay here for at least 3-4 hours because you have been you're a kind of artist where we wonder, like, are you 60 or like how can you have done so much? And I'm quite impressed. And I think it's
Moisturizer.
yeah,
I recommend it.
and the gray hair doesn't actually. But I mean, objectively, it's quite impressive the amount of stuff you've done and how young you started. And I think we'd like to kind of, I don't know, we can kickstart a bit of how it's. I'm very curious on how you feel that your position in Glasgow and how, the scene has been kind of flourishing as far as I'm concerned as a consumer. I was very impressed when I was in London and I was taking any excuse that I could to travel to all these kind of festivals that were showing. That's how I saw your work. And I can see that now, some of those acts and some of the things that have been done 20 years ago are still avant-gardist for me. So I'm wondering, like, if you would like to start, like, on a kind of a loose biography on how you got to approach all this kind of a media centered around, the moving image, the sound installation, your obsession with archiving and how you work. So Isabel has a lot of questions about how you choose people. I don't know. So why don't you just start a bit on an overall kind of informal presentation of yourself and your work?
Thank you for coming on such a beautiful day, and thank you to everyone for FICUNAM for bringing me over to Mexico for the first time. So it's a real pleasure to be here in this context, and also to be on the jury of the festival. So I get to see lots of films I wouldn't ordinarily be able to access. So it's really wonderful for me opportunity. There was a joke between my peers when I was at art school that they had about me, and the joke was whether I was going to be an artist or a musician when I left art school, because I spend a lot of time on the computer making music, and at that time in the mid-90s, it was like the rise of digitally, this new way of making music with computers and software. So it was really kind of cutting edge. You had Mago, Peter Rayberg editions of Mago, and Aphex Twin and people like this making music with not using hardware anymore, but with the software. And it was in the hands of the people, from being previously something that only institutions could do. And my brother was a computer programmer from about the age of 6 or 7. He started young on a Dragon 32 computer. The 32 was 32 kilobytes of memory that the computer had. And now my phone has something like, 32 gigabytes of memory. So it's a very different time of using computers. And so I was at art school experimenting with video and making music and sound to go onto video, to go into the videos I was making. I was making soundtracks for videos. But and there was this time-based art department at Dundee, headed by Stephen Partridge. So I was being exposed to this history of video art. Do I need to pause? And yeah, I was also from my partner at the time was very interested in the London Filmmakers Co-op and in Flickr films. So she was hiring herself Paul Sharratt's films and Tony Conrad films. And I was aware of this kind of disjunction between, or the antagonism between the video art and experimental film. And yet I was also had been grown up watching television, and in Britain in the 80s, television was really a golden age. It was actually worth watching. Now I don't watch television anymore. I've not had a television for exactly for about 20 years. And but when I was watching television was like my father was a cineast, and he would force me to watch Andrei Tarkovsky films and Fassbinder and Antonioni, and also Ken Loach and Mike Leigh. And as a 10-year-old, it was maybe quite hard to understand the psychological ramifications of something like Solaris. And when, I'd been watching Star Wars the day before. So it was, but I knew this was different and important, but I didn't quite know the signification of it for me. And so when I went to art school, really one of the epiphanies for me was I had this lecturer called Alan Wood, who was a signed up member of the Situationist International and was writing a book about Ralph Rumney, one of the only British members of the Situationists. And he had early access to Johann Grimonprez's Dial History. It's an amazing artistic essay based on the books of Don DeLillo, White Noise, I think it is. And it's an essay about skyjacking, but set to a disco soundtrack. And so I loved this film, and I saw it for the first time, and it was really like a complete epiphany for me, because up till then I'd just been watching very boring video art, like with a lot of performance to camera and very serious and very low production values. And all of a sudden I was seeing something that was much more like the television documentaries I like, Melvin Bragg and Arena and the South Bank Show and the sort of things I'd seen on television. But also it was done by an artist, so it was very, irreverent and aesthetic and anarchic, and didn't conform to traditional modes of documentary. So then this was like an open door for me to try to make something like this on my own. And I don't know how much time we have, but so I made my first film, was called What You See Is Where You're At, and it was about the R.D. Laing, a Scottish psychiatrist, and the Kingsley Hall experiment, which was this social experiment into creating a radical alternative to mental hospital. And why did you make this film as a serious 18-year-old? I was seeing my father having interactions with the mental health services in Scotland, and it was, to me, felt very dehumanizing. It was like, take the drugs, shut up, go away, and not really listening. No, not like this kind of Freudian history of like psychoanalysis. You can't afford that on the NHS. So it's very much a drugs-based solution to mental health problems. And I started to realize through R.D. Laing that, there's not just the sane and the insane, there's not just like the healthy and the unhealthy in society. We're all on a continuum, and that we can all fall into states of unhealth or, states where we lose our way and we need help. And ideally, we don't want to be given a chemical cosh, when we need this help to find our way again back to society. So R.D. Laing talked about this idea of not just break down, but break through to a new sanity, And it was very radical. They had a lot of artists and writers would come and give talks and perform, and there was no distinction between the therapists and the patients. They were just all living together as one. A bit like Laborde, the Guattari experiment. And so I made this film, and that was really the start for me of making videos, and then moved on to using 16mm in around 2005, 2006. Before then, all the films were made with archival footage through editing, some Super 8, some home movie VHS that I was shooting. So it was very DIY aesthetic up until then.
So I wanted to ask you, one of the things I've noticed from your work, particularly your films, but I think it's even in the piece that you're presenting here today, is that you tend to choose subjects or topics that are in the margins, that are kind of, that they weren't chosen by cultural history, like the normalized version of cultural history, and you tend to kind of dig them out from the dark spaces where they live. So I wanted to ask, how you pick these subjects and these topics, and then if you could delve and explain a little bit more about your creative process. So how that, you choose those, and then how you decide to work with layers of sound and archives and the 16mm for your work.
It's a good question. I mean, I think, now as like a 45-year-old filmmaker, in Scotland, people throughout my life, people have said to me, "Oh, your film should be on television." I play in mostly my films are in museums or galleries or film festivals. These subcultural sites, and television is not really. It's part of a dominant ideology. So it doesn't really want to represent anarchic, counter cultural figures. And if it does, it wants to recuperate them in a very safe way. So it's a very homogenous kind of culture. And now I'm not interested in reproducing kind of patriarchy or dominant ideologies. So I was always interested in figures that, pushed against those forces and thought about different ways of living, of being. And I see that, like, when I come to Mexico, in the anthropology museum, there's, peyote and discussions about celestial and primordial ways of being and magic. And I think, yes, these should be part of the discourse of everyday life. And hopefully in Mexico they are, because you come from an indigenous culture that values these different knowledges. But Western kind of positivist, capitalist realism doesn't value these knowledges and essentially squashes and levels down culture into a very commodified way of exchanging. So, yeah, I that's why I've always been drawn to these figures that are on the margins and that are not represented by dominant field of vision. And then the second question was about, like, the part of the questions about how they're made, or
yeah, exactly. So once you choose them,
yeah,
how does your creative process start?
well, it's a different for each film, but ideally when I started out, I was doing a lot of research, and I was very intellectually engaged with the subject. And then something happened in my life where I don't know if it was a penny dropping, there's an expression, or conversations with other filmmakers, especially one filmmaker who was like a mentor to me was an American filmmaker who lived in Greece for a long time called Robert Beavers, whose film was presented last night. And I remember having this discussion about researching. Do you do research when you make films? Because I spend a lot of time doing research when I make my films. And mostly I would maybe spend a year researching a film, and then before I've even shot anything. And he said to me, sometimes yes, sometimes no. It just depends, and each project is different. And sometimes it's good to not know why you're making a film, but just to go with your senses, with your instinct, and to gather the material, and then have a more free improvised way of making films. And that was really, again, like another epiphany for me, was that I didn't have to get bogged down with like reading every single thing, every single word and opinion about Cornelius Cardew or R.D. Laing or E.P. Thompson, and feeling the weight of history and this. So now I feel quite kind of exposed, because when I make a film, often, sometimes I'm just going into the situation very innocently, like a child.
I think I'd like to pick up on the fact that you use free improvisation now, and speaking about how you get inspired and who you use as a subject. Now that I know a bit more on how you started at 10 watching those films, and at 18 doing that kind of intense, quite difficult kind of subject to look into, and it's a bit clearer to me why with all the research that you do, how complex, although it's innocent maybe in the actual result, but there's a lot of meticulous. There is a meticulous research behind it anyway. You can see it, and also the amount of cross collaboration. And I think, if you go back to the fact that your brother was doing computer science, that your friends were saying, are you going to be an artist, a filmmaker, or a musician? You have used music a lot in your work, either directly by playing, either by collaborating with a lot of people that are into free improvisation, that use objects, noise, sound, amplifiers, from Mark Fell to Patterson, which is more like analog. You've done a film on Cornelius Cardew, which, I wonder whether it's more about the political side of Cornelius Cardew or more the treat. So I think, there's a lot of things that you actually put together. And I think it's a good way to kind of discuss a bit that part before you talk about the actual sound piece there, because that's, again, another sound piece that's connecting, over 7 or 8 different constellation of things inside a little map. So coming from the fact of choosing subjects in a film, how do you choose your collaborations as far as music, sound projects, which may involve image or not? How does it come with, again, lots of friends in common, but I wonder how you, obviously sometimes it can be a curator calling you or a piece, maybe they call you or you call them. There must be a lot of curiosity in you to kind of reach out to people or they come to you. I don't know. So how does it all kind of start?
Well, I started off in bands, like a lot of people that have the, I was going to say misfortune to learn guitar, acoustic guitar, because actually I don't very much like the guitar as an instrument. Sorry, guitarists. At least not the conventional way of playing guitar. I like people like Keith Rowe, who put the guitar on the table and attack it with objects. So I was in bands, this very kind of, I was going to say macho, phallic-centered way of playing music.
We're talking about teenaging?
Yeah, teenage, and then also in art school as well, and then got into kind of improvising and playing with people as an improviser. But I was always the person that was like the Brian Eno, the kind of wild card, just making it up and experimenting with objects and synthesizers and tapes and loops and field recordings, using sound itself as my medium rather than specializing as a trained virtuoso musician and instrumentalist. And, that has its pros and cons. But it meant that I always had this kind of appetite for looking at what other people were doing in this world. And that was when, so I would meet people like Lee Patterson, who was doing similar things to what I was doing, but far more advanced, because he wasn't also making films at the same time. And so he could dedicate his life's work to this. Or Eric Lacasa and Toshio Tsunoda, Keith Rowe, I collaborated with. Made the wonderful thing about collaborating, whether it's with, a musician or another artist like Peter Hutton or my partner Corin Swarn, who I'm collaborating with now. It just, there's this dialogic way of working, and you counteract your instinct and your habit, because art is a very habit forming thing. There's a reason why Cézanne painted his beloved Mount Saint mountain over and over and over again. Perhaps if he'd been working collaboratively. Yes. You want me to go on?
Can I build on that? So now that we're on the collaboration space, is there any particular collaboration that you've had that's shaped your perspective or your work or the way you see your practice?
Well, they're all profoundly influential on my life and my practice, and they become friends as well, and so complete. I don't think I've had a collaboration that has failed to have an impact, even if it's been difficult to make the project. But I went to art school and I didn't go to film school, so I was a kind of autodidact filmmaker. And like I say, I'm also a non-musician. I learned a bit of guitar when I was a teenager, but threw that all away and started again with inventing instruments. And so one has to then choose your mentors and keep on, pushing yourself to learn and to. I don't think you ever stop learning about your art and how it can develop. So yeah, I'm very fortunate that people humor me by wanting to work together.
So collaboration is kind of that mentorship space for you as well, then.
Yes, yeah. And I think, I reject the Hollywood model of the producer and the camera person and the sound person, because it's a very hierarchical way of working, and it also just, as an artist, there was never the budgets to do that. But I guess, maybe producers can also be collaborators as well, and it isn't just a relationship that is stifling or bound by economic considerations.
Do you want to go, Eddie?
I think you have a few questions about the aesthetics on his filmmaking, and I also thought, since we're part of, where again your work is and right now you're presenting your work in a film festival, not in a music festival, or I don't know if this is a space where you can also tell us about the films you're presenting at your Umbral, which would also connect to Isabel's questions on some of the aesthetic work that you're doing, and then we can kind of move on to the sound installation, and then open up to the public, and then do a sort of a mix and match. But again, we know the films that you presented because they sent us the list, but on the program it only says Umbral Luke Fowler, so nobody knows how many, what they are. And so maybe it'd be nice if you talk about those very briefly, especially since there's a connection.
Yeah, there is a connection.
So
the two most recent films are a portrait of a musique concrète composer called Brunhilde Ferrari, who was better known as the wife of Luke Ferrari, and prior to being known as Brunhilde Ferrari, she was known as Brunhilde Meyer. And Brunhilde selflessly devoted her life to Luke's practice. And so this was, and of course, I love Luke's work, and Prescrien was, Luke Ferrari is a musique concrète composer who was one of the founding members of the Groupe de Recherche de Musique with Pierre Schaeffer in the 50s in Paris. And they were really like the other side of the WDR Stockhausen electronic music side. They were making music with recordings, with actuality, with found sound. And Pierre Schaeffer had a whole kind of ideology about the acousmatic, about not being able to see the sound that was generating the noise. He felt if you saw the origin of the sound, then it took away the magic and the imagination of the composition. So Luke created this work that really changed the landscape, and it continues to change the landscape of music forever by creating this piece called Preskrien, which was recorded in Croatia in a fishing village. And it's a portrait of this village in sound that he recorded over a number of days whilst he was on holiday, and then painstakingly stitched it all together. And there's no electronic treatment. It's not like a Stockhausen piece where he's altering, the voices of Gesang der Junge, of children. There's no musical instruments. It's just nature. It's just reality unfolding. But it's like it was like 433 Cage's work in its importance for making us realize how musical, or how not even how musical field recording could be, but how the world of music could embrace the world of sound in a larger way, in a larger discussion, aesthetic discussion. Yeah.
Deviate from her.
No, but it's important.
Context.
And so Brunhild was working in the margins as the editor for Luke. She was making her own pieces very quietly for German radio. But really she was not known as a composer. And she still runs after Luke died in 2006, I believe, she continued to run and publish the Luke Fowler Foundation and publish books on, with Thurston Moore, on Thurston Moore's Ecstatic Peace label about, Luke's complete works but also some recordings kind of slowly sneaked out of her own work, which were very exciting and enticing and different from Luke's, but using similar techniques. So I had an opportunity to meet her through David Grubbs, the musician, and I went to visit her in her home in the suburbs of Paris, in Montreuil, and this encounter became a film, a portrait. And because I had a deadline of an exhibition that this film was going to be in, I couldn't fully use all of the footage that I had shot. So I then made a follow-up, part 2, and FICUNAM will be the world premiere of N'importe quoi, extérieur jour. Excuse my poor Français. Featuring Brunhild Ferrari and also with Eric Lacasa doing the sound on the second part. And then there's some other films that FICUNAM, that Max wanted to show a program of my work of films that hadn't been shown yet in FICUNAM since I think around 2010 or something, or 2014, maybe the last 10 years. So he's showing Mum's Cards for Dan, and these 2 short films are like portraits of my parents, kind of obliquely, because neither of them are represented visually, through the body anyway, in these portraits. they're represented through, in my mother's case, through her index card archive, where she made a record of every book that she ever read. So it's at this point, it's the thousands of cards. And I'm talking to her about this archive, personal archive. And then in the case of my father, who died in 2000, the connection to him is through one of his best friends, because he was Australian, my father, and had a very thick Australian accent, even though he lived in Glasgow. It didn't shake his accent. And my mum also has an English accent, so I'm a kind of bastard. Split, yeah. So because he's absent from the portrait, I couldn't talk to him. As an adult, I lost my father when I was 20, so as an adult, I was really trying to to get to know him better. And the way I did this was through his best friend, who's still alive and lives in Australia. And he's a radical lecturer at Queensland University, called Dan O'Neill. So the film is a portrait of letters. Again, the written word, writing appears in both of these films as the main protagonist, you could say.
Do you think so? Something that was interesting for me for those two particular films is the way that kind of memory is stored, right? So your mom has the index cards, and then there's these letters from your dad to his best friend. But it doesn't seem that, if we were to try to attempt something like that with the way people archive their memory today, it would be a whole different challenge, because you would have to go for like WhatsApp messages somewhere, or, So I'm just wondering, how do you see kind of experimental film moving, archives, the things that you experiment with, that you work with? Will there be new kind of challenges as people move from that kind of, physical thing to the digital part of it?
Absolutely. In a way, it's like a kind of paean to writing, to the handwritten note, and how important it has been for us culturally in terms of memory, what that does in the mnemonics of writing, and just the trace of the personal, of the individual. My father had very, very bad handwriting. It was almost indecipherable. So in a way, I had to work collaboratively with these other people to decipher, to crack the code of his writings, which clearly you wouldn't have the problem if he used a word processor. But word processors were not used back in the 1960s. And so he just wrote on these... that's actually even more about the kind of material history of humans, is that he wrote on these. And I'm kind of eternally fascinated by things like the medium and materials and the materiality of living, and how that shapes art and communication. And so when he was writing to his best friend from Australia to England, he was writing on a aerogram paper, which, for those who were not born in the 70s and don't remember or don't know what aerogram paper was, it was a folded preset, a kind of prescribed form where you could write a letter and then fold it up, and then it would be so thin that it would go for the price of one stamp. So you couldn't put anything, you couldn't put a postcard in there or a photograph or anything like that. It had to be just the text. And the paper was so thin that it would often penetrate through to the other side. So make it even harder to read. But you all know what I'm talking about. Anyway, yeah, so this, I mean, even in my lifetime, like growing up in the 80s and 90s, like I look at my archives now and there's like mini discs, there's cassette tapes, there's diaries, and you know, I'm very sad about all the correspondence I have had on email, and then because it's all gone now, or it's in the hands of Google, the evil empire.
Yeah, and do you see, in terms of the future of experimental film, do you see that evolving, and where do you see yourself in that kind of landscape? Maybe for some other time.
Future of experimental film. I mean, I don't even know how experimental. I mean, I think I'm experimental, but a lot of experimental with a capital E, experimental filmmakers probably wouldn't consider me to be an experimental filmmaker. It's a very guarded terrain. There's a lot of gatekeepers in experimental film. I remember doing a talk at Nowhere Lab in London, and A.L. Rees, who was in the audience, he's a scholar of experimental film and wrote a history of experimental film in Britain. And he was, very upset with my films. He just didn't see what was experimental about them. He just thought they were eccentric documentaries. So I'm kind of, I feel like my life is experimental, but I'm also living in a society that is very constrained and very rule-bound. So, I'm also thinking about how experimental can we really be in capitalism?
So maybe we can...
Does that answer your question?
Well, the sound sculpture is experimental in the sense that it experiments. I mean, in the end, the problem with the word experimental is that it's an easy word to kind of put together. And I think it's...
Well, I think when people think about experimental film, unfortunately, they think about stand brackage.
Yeah, of course. Paint and breaking and cut and splice and all that. And that's why now they call it expanded cinema. It becomes kind of... But at least it's getting a little bit broader than it was some years ago. I know
we're getting away from the stale male history of white history, and this is what bring it back to being in Mexico. And for me, is such a kind of eye opener. Seeing a Latin American experimental film is incredible.
See some of them, like today, there's something like this.
Yeah,
but also Umbral, as they said on the opening, it's pretty recent. It's only 3-4 years ago. So out of a festival of 14 years edition, it's not like Rotterdam, which all those. So it's kind of entering slowly, and there's a very nice community here of filmmakers, and they started over 10-15 years ago. Yeah. And I was quite obsessed with it. I used to invite always kind of one, Bruce McClure or Metam Keen or. And it's always quite enchanting because of the sound of the 16 mil, and again, all that is from your.
I think it's really important that like what Max and Salvatore, the curators are doing is trying to create this community, and what you did with your festival, And
I think it's
not just importing culture from the US or Europe.
So. When I saw you a few days ago, I thought if it wasn't for those 20 minutes, 30 minutes chat that we had, because again, you're a great speaker, and I think it's very nice to hear your stories and all that. And I think it's a great story in the room up there. And I know there's a nice text, but I think people would there's so much in there that I would like you to kind of explain a little bit, because I don't know if everybody should know who Gareth is, who Harry Parch is, who Advan Lucier is, and all what a contact mic is, what the bowl is. I mean, if you think about the amount of information with those four
but also you don't need to get bogged down with that as well.
But it's actually quite nice. Like if you think about where the bowls come from, and I think that's kind of a nice way to treat the sound that emanates from there. And then the fact that your latest film has her talking to Advan Lucier. I mean, again, the piano playing, and again, I don't know how many people stay 20 minutes in a sound piece, but I think it's nice to know how you came up with it, or how it arrived, and how it was in Germany with Gareth's walls that you said. So if you don't mind,
sure,
going through a bit, whatever is not written on the pamphlet, but it will be, so then we can invite people to kind of interact with it and have more questions.
Sure. Well, I've not read the pamphlet, so the sculpture came out of a dialogue with Gareth and Evans, who was one of my mentors a long time ago, but we continue to be friends. And Gareth worked with Derek Jarman as a Super 8 filmmaker, shooting with Jarman, shooting for Jarman, and collaborating with him, and was also became known in the early 80s as this new romantic cinema with people like John Maybury and so on. And but then he kind of moved away from making video and film, which I don't know if he ever made video, but from making Super 8 films into making sculptures. But he still used sound in some of these sculptures. And he has collaborated with some incredible people like Brian Geisen and Ian Hamilton Finlay and Throbbing Gristle. And it was actually with Throbbing Gristle that I first saw his work in the flesh. It was at the Yokohama Biennale Triennale in 2007, and we were both exhibiting, and Gareth had this piece with Throbbing Gristle, which was these, if you will allow me to describe it, because it had a great impact on me, these mirrors in a mobile, a kind of Calder-esque mobile, but with these reflective mirrored speakers. But the speakers that were using a special technology where they were just applied like a thin surface onto, so they were invisible. They didn't look like traditional speakers. There's no cone on them. So he could, and then they moved in the space and diffused the sound, the multi-channel sound around the space of the exhibition that Throbbing Gristle had composed. And I'd made a installation with Toshio Tsunoda called Composition for Flutter Screen. And so Gareth came in and saw this, and he was like, wow. And I saw his piece and I was like, wow. And then we, some 10 years later or something, we kept on saying we should collaborate. And I was thinking about the mobile and lots of other things, like Harry Parch, who was a 20th century American queer composer who was working with microtonality and inventing instruments. And he made this instrument called the Cloud Chamber, which used these Pyrex bowls that themselves were taken from a laboratory where they synthesized clouds in the 50s. So he repurposed these massive big Pyrex test tube bowls, and cut them in half, and then played them, tuned them into microtonal scales, and played them on a kind of tree. So you can see, if you look up Cloud Chamber by Harry Parch, you'll see like a tree or like a grid of all these different these different glass bowls. So I kind of wanted to make my own version of that, and then was talking to Kerith about the mobile form, and so we kind of pushed these ideas together, and then this collaboration came. And but the sound on the the question was then, well, what sound shall we put on these speakers? I missed an important part of the story, which is that the bowls aren't played like Harry Parch played them. He played them with mallets, so he played them like gongs or bells. Instead, I wanted to use these exciters, which again comes from, I'm sounding really like an encyclopedia here, but came from this like love that Kerith and I have of David Tudor and his work with turning objects into speakers. So we use this technology called an exciter, which can turn any surface into a speaker, and they use them in like shopping malls to turn where or in domestic situations they use them where you don't want to see a speaker, so they'll attach this exciter, and it replaces a traditional speaker, and it makes the object vibrate, but it only vibrates at the frequency in which the object is. It's very it's distorted by the object you put it on. So if you want a very white, like a normal sound or like a good sound, you would put it on something that was like a guitar body or a cello or something like that, that is made to be a resonant object. But a glass bell has a very specific, it resonates, but it resonates at a very specific frequency range. So if there was no sub-bass in my piece, there's no bass, actually there's no mid frequencies either, really. It's just all very high frequencies. But I like it. Sorry, that was about rambling.
It's a good ramble before they take it out. So we could open the mic, as they say.
Everyone's still awake.
How you like it, Mexico, so far? I know you wanted to record Trotsky's house, and you've done some recordings here.
Yeah, I did a bit. I have my I have my 16mm camera and did some filming at the Trotsky house because I'm kind of interested in rooms, and I'm making a film about a house at the moment that was built by Peter Wormsley and was the house of a textile designer. So and I also filmed in Cézanne's house studio. So I kind of I've got a thing about houses.
Y aquí también.
Oh, Anna, you have a question. You're just batting it.
What's that? Hello. Well, I wanted to ask you. Hello. I wanted to ask you about what do you think about artificial intelligence? Do you think it's a blessing or is it a curse for creative filmmaking?
Oh, wasn't expecting that. Question. Yeah. I just read this quote by Noam Chomsky where he's talking. Have you read this? This is like he's talking about artificial intelligence, and is it really intelligent just to plagiarize the world's riches of knowledge? That's not really intelligent. Intelligence is synthesis. It's making something new. This is just kind of mimesis. So I don't know. I'm a bit like down on AI.
Thank you.
No. If you don't have a question, I'm just going to choose people in the audience.
Hi, ¿puedo hacer la pregunta en español o en inglés? Ah, ok. Bueno,
I'll see it. I'll test this
Sí.
translator.
me espero tantito.
Go.
Ok, bueno, mi pregunta es ¿cómo es que tú, Luke, encuentras un balance entre la experimentación, la creatividad pues libre, con esa parte como racional de un artista, a decir como esto tal vez no tenga sentido, ¿no? O sea, ¿cómo encuentras como ese balance entre la experimentación con esa parte racional de ser un artista?
How do I find the balance between creativity, experimentation, and the rational part of being an artist? It's difficult. I think, I don't know if all artists have this problem, but now, we find ourselves dealing with, being office workers, like administrators. A lot of the time I'm just writing emails to people, trying to get paid, dealing with institutional systems as so mind-numbingly uncreative or experimental. And sometimes I do and then I'm looking after my son and telling him to put his shoes on and to clean his room and all the humdrum things of everyday life, and making dinner, and then I think where's the experiment? When does the experiment start? When does the artistic part of my life start? Yeah. Yeah, I think that's it's wonderful about actually, I find about going to a film festival is you can look at what other people have done and listen to, idiots like me ramble on about why they do what they do, and how they, came to find a subject to wrestle with. And I'm going to be on this jury, so I'll get to hear what other people think experimental film is. And I think that's, it's a constant battle. You can't seriously expect me to answer that. It's a PhD thesis. You're too good.
¿Alguien más?
Va a ser en español. Ok. Solo no es una pregunta. Que si has visto cine experimental recientemente que te haya emocionado como algo nuevo. O sea, creadores actuales. Gracias.
Thank you. I saw an amazing film by Robert Beavers called The Sparrow Dream that was on last night, but unfortunately I couldn't go. And there was a wonderful film. And then, but you know, like sometimes it's not just experimental films that excite me. Like I went to a talk by Walid Rad, and when I was showing some films at Harvard, and again, this was like incredible. I thought it was such an amazing thing. But yeah, I've been making this film about Margaret Tate, was a British experimental filmmaker, but she would not call herself an experimental filmmaker. And it was the first film I've made about another filmmaker. And I really loved it because prior to that, I made a film with Peter Hutton, who's a filmmaker I really love. And that was really such a gift, a generous experience for me. But making the film about Margaret, I really could get inside her world and think about, what her project was. Thank you. Yeah.
¿Alguna otra pregunta? Well, I think we can close well, thank you very much. I must say it was lovely to be on a wonderful
Thanks, Eric.
place.
Thanks, Isabel.
Oh, thank you.
Dos cosas. Una que salió hace una hora. Bueno, no, dos. Muy informalmente. Me quedé un poquito frustrado esta mañana al saber que Luke, con todo lo que está haciendo aquí, no va a ser un performance. Y a la media hora vi en su Instagram que ha estado practicando un set para un concierto el sábado en Toronto. Entonces decidimos que íbamos a hacer un pequeño concierto impromptu mañana después de su programación.
Throwing me in the deep end.
Totally, because we're going to have... Seremos 5, 10, 20, 30, no sabemos. Hacer una cosa muy informal, pero si quieren... me pueden preguntar aquí y les diré la secret location. Y la cosa más importante es que sí, les invitamos a pasar a ver la expo. Y bueno, obviamente si quieren platicar más a detalle de la pieza. Y pues yo agradezco a FICUNAM, a Casa del Lago, a ti, a Isabel y a todos ustedes. Y espero que puedan ver todo lo que ofrece el festival los próximos 8 días. Gracias.
Gracias.
Gracias a todos.